afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 27th weekly Franczek webinar since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today also marks my 22nd year with the firm, so a special shout out to those of you watching who have been with us since the beginning of my time at Franczek. It's all flown by, especially in the last 7 months, I'll say. I'm Shelli Anderson, one of the panel members. We have no moderator this week, so the three of us are flying a bit by the seat of our pants, so hopefully you'll come along for the ride. This week's webinar is It's Gone Viral, Teacher and Student Speech. We'll be discussing First Amendment issues for students and teachers. We are so happy to have you with us for the next hour, and thank you for joining us today and for submitting your questions during registration and during the webinar. For those of you who haven't been with us before, we like to have the questions done through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and we do our best to cover them. Today on the panel, I'm pleased to be joined by our regular panelists, Nicki Bazer.
Hi, everyone.
And Dana Fattore Crumley.
Good afternoon.
Before we jump into our discussion related to First Amendment, I want to highlight our topic for next week that we're really excited about, leadership in the time of COVID. We'll be joined by Superintendent Nick Poliak from Leiden and Mike Lubefeld from North Shore School District 112. You should have already seen the registration announcement go out, but we'll certainly send a reminder in the next coming days for those of you who still want to register. Let us know if you have any questions throughout the registration process or by emailing covid@franczek.com. Find yourself looking for more information, or if we're not able to get to your question today, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. If you missed any of our prior webinars, you can find them all on our website under events@franczek.com. And while you're there, please take a look at their other webinars, alerts, blogs, and podcasts on a wide range of school law topics. So I think we'll just jump right in. I'm going to do my best at moderating a bit here. We'll get started with our discussion on First Amendment in public schools in the time of COVID. So Nicki, let's start. Can you give us a general overview of the First Amendment rights of students in school?
Yeah, absolutely, Shelli. I want to say at the outset too, this applies certainly to student First Amendment rights, and I think it will apply throughout what we're talking about today, which is that First Amendment rights is a really complicated area of law. It's a really fact-intensive area of law. It's a really case-determinative area of law. And so we're going to give you the highlights and the basics and think through some of the issues that we're seeing in school districts right now. But we really do encourage you, if you have an issue come up, to talk with your legal counsel to work through it, because again, there's a lot of pitfalls here and there's a lot of places that one can go wrong. So, but with that warning, with that disclaimer, so speech for students. I do want to start with, talking for a second about what is not protected speech before we get into what is protected. When we're talking about student speech, unprotected speech would be things like obscenity, child pornography. This would go for adults as well. Fighting words, defamation, threats. In the educational realm, courts have also recognized that schools may limit student speech that is vulgar or indecent or plainly offensive, as well as student speech on issues like advocating illegal drug use and that sort of thing. So there's going to be an area of speech that students engage in that is unprotected. And so we do want to make sure that we catch that. But when we're talking about protected speech, so speech that is covered by the First Amendment, the test or the standard for student speech is you can limit student speech in a school building if there's a reasonable belief that such speech will cause or has already caused a substantial disruption. This is where it gets really murky really quickly. You can't just sort of fear that there might be a disruption. You actually have to have a good faith, reasonably founded belief. There's lots of factors that you can look at. Has this kind of speech caused disruption before? Have you already seen some disruption? Are you getting parents calling? Are you getting students? Is it on Twitter? Is everything sort of swirling around this speech? So there's a lot of factors to look at. So again, we do encourage you to reach out, to think through these issues if you're going to curtail student speech because of the substantial disruption factor. Well, a couple other things that I just want to note about student speech. Again, that's a really broad standard that, again, case by case you have to implement. One thing that districts can do and not run afoul of the First Amendment is content neutral policies. So if you have an interest in implementing a policy that applies across the board, not based on content, when we, the ones that come to mind obviously are dress codes where we say you can't wear anything with writing on it other than spirit wear. So that doesn't differentiate between what people are wearing, what speech is on their shirt or on their hat or on their mask now.
Oh, did Nikki freeze? Are we, Shelli, you're on mute, I think.
I think she's coming back. Nikki,
Okay, all right.
I'm sorry, I think I'm going in and out. The only other thing that I would just mention on student speech is off-campus student speech can also potentially be something subject to discipline, but you do need that nexus with the school environment. So if you are seeing that substantial disruption within the school environment because of off-campus speech, that you could potentially regulate that. Again, there's a lot of different factors that go into that, but that is also speech that could potentially be regulated.
So I'm going to speak briefly about the issue as it relates to teachers and what First Amendment rights teachers have. And again, remember, we're talking about public school employees and whether or not that's similar to how we can regulate student speech. And I want to be clear first that when I'm talking about First Amendment speech for teachers, I'm talking about speech outside of the school building. They have much less right to express themselves and their opinions in the school building and when they're acting as teachers, and we'll talk a bit about that in our scenarios that we have throughout the presentation. But with respect to speech that's outside the school building, first we have to look at kind of the standards that are out there, and these are the same that have been in place since 1968, and it's called the Pickering Test, for those of you law nerds out there who know what that is. And really what we're looking at is the first question is the person, so is that public employee speaking as a private citizen, or are they speaking as a public employee? And I'll tell you that typically a person is speaking as a private citizen when they're doing so on their private Twitter page or on their personal Facebook page and things like that. An employee is only deemed to be speaking in their public capacity if the actual speaking is part of their public duty. So for instance, if you have a high-level administrator or a department chair or someone who is supposed to speak within their duties, whether it's on behalf of the school or on behalf of a department, that can be seen as them not acting as a private citizen, which would end the analysis. But let's assume it's a private citizen. So our teachers out there right now who are openly expressing their opinions, for instance, on reopening issues, the next question we look at is, are they speaking on a matter of public concern? And certainly the election, reopening issues, COVID in general, mask wearing, all of those things are going to be considered a matter of public concern, which means that that speech in and of itself would be protected, even if it's negative against the school district. And I think that's a really something that is very offensive, especially maybe to some of our school boards who are looking at everything that's being done with respect to reopening plans, and that they're seeing out there some negative commentary about those plans, or really, some really hateful things that we'll talk about some of the examples, but that's still protected unless, when you look at the balance, it really impedes the district's ability to move forward with its planning, or it affects that teacher's ability to actually do their job, so they actually work effectively. So you really have to look at that standard when we're assessing whether or not we can tell someone to stop speaking or to discipline someone for their speech. And so it's a standard that we, as was mentioned before by Nikki, that you're involving counsel, because it can be tricky to defend these lawsuits, and you want to make sure that you're kind of on solid footing.
So Shelli, you talked a little bit about what teachers can speak about when they're in their private lives. But what about school speech or district speech, things that are official from the district? What's the danger in, obviously there's lots of things that districts may want to speak out on, but what is the concern that we have to be mindful of? Like forum issues, I guess. That's sort of another inquiry, is like teachers, when they're by themselves or when they're on their own Facebook page, may say things, but if the district says something, if the district posts things, and they are just speech for the sake of speech rather than related to a district curricular initiative, we might have opening the forum issues, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, and just what are some of the pitfalls of that, maybe?
Yeah, I think that you've described kind of the two ways that the district can do this. We're talking about kind of district speech and whether they're speaking and it is actually part of a curriculum, right? So we certainly have seen a number of districts that put out For instance, I'll use the Black Lives Matter example with respect to it. They're putting out that speech, but it relates to the curriculum that they are teaching with respect to kind of that in their school building. And then there's the other side of it where it's Black Lives Matter as part of a larger inclusion statement, and that it's really speaking on the mission of the district as opposed to part of the curriculum, and how that is also protected if it's being done for reasons that are, for instance, not political. Because that's what really happens when you have individuals who might not agree with what you're saying. They reach out and claim the district is putting out there is political in nature, which we of course know that we shouldn't be taking sides on a political issue from a public perspective, whether it's employee or the school district. So that's really a pitfall. So you have to be mindful of how you're doing that and how you're presenting that to the world.
Right. So, and we'll talk about that as we get into our more specific examples, which we have many specific examples that we've received from you, and we'll go through those in a little while here. So I think the last aspect of speech is just speech by the teacher union generally. And there's obviously teachers unions, as Shelli mentioned, can have their own web presence. They may have Facebook pages. They may have Twitter accounts. And if they are speaking out on matters of public concern, they have First Amendment rights that are somewhat hard to curtail. Even if we're not liking what they're saying, a lot of it is going to be protected speech, and we have to, respect that. Then there's the whole issue of the teachers' use of the internal system, which we're not really going to go into very deeply today, but we wanted to raise it just to identify it as an issue, is teachers using the internal communication system, the email system. And again, you have the same forum issues there. If you open the forum and let the teachers sort of use it for whatever, a local political initiative, maybe it's something locally, an ordinance or something, or maybe it's a national political election. Once you open that to that type of speech, then you're opening it to anyone else that wants to come in. So if you have one side of the issue, you're going to have to open it to the other side of the issue. So in many cases, districts keep their email system closed. They let the union use it as the exclusive bargaining representative of its teachers, and they conduct business, but it's not a forum to use for campaigning or politicking in any way, just to keep that forum closed.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add quickly about the whole union issue is that, the unions also do have some rights under the Education Labor Relations Act to speak on behalf of the union, but they don't have any greater rights than they do to speak on the First Amendment. So I think that when you're looking at that analysis, I think some union reps really feel like they can say, well, I'm speaking on behalf of the union, therefore everything I say is protected. And that itself also requires an analysis because it's not greater rights than they would be afforded otherwise under the First Amendment. You land before the Labor Relations Board instead of in court for those types of issues.
Yes, I think that's another common theme, is that everybody thinks that they have way more First Amendment rights than they do.
Yeah, we were talking about during that this might be the thing that rivals HIPAA as
Yeah.
Where there's misconception as to what legal rights people have and how they use those terms and throw them out there to think they are, but they're not in many instances. I know that we're having a little bit of difficulty and that Nicki is trying to get back with us. So for now, Dana and I will do our best to kind of get through the material that we hope to get through in answering your questions. But we're going to transition into some real world situations here. And I'm going to start and ask Dana, let's say your district's teacher union has a Twitter handle and they post a picture of a group of teachers in Black Lives Matter t-shirts. Is that permissible?
That is permissible. Teachers on their own Twitter account can put up whatever political message that they'd like to put up. It can be a political message, it can be affiliated to a certain group. There's nothing that we can do about that, and we shouldn't try to control that because that is well within their First Amendment rights.
Okay. And then I'm going to address a situation that is similar to that, but really has a different outcome, and that's this idea of a group of teachers who might be displaying Black Lives Matter posters in the windows of their classroom that are visible to the students that are passing by. And the question being, kind of, is that permissible speech? And there it is probably not when they're doing it from their classroom, because it's opening the forum. And it relates to whether it's a part of the curriculum or not. So is it mandated that they provide that area of expertise and knowledge or not. So it probably is not. I'm going to let Nicki, if you're, oh.
Guys, I'm really sorry. I'm having massive internet problems. I can't even hear you. What's the question?
I was starting to talk about whether or not the teachers who were perhaps putting signs up in their windows of Black Lives Matter, whether or not that was permissible speech or not.
So and let me know if you can't hear me, just start shouting. A group of teachers displaying posters in their classroom windows, is that what we're talking about? So, you know, probably it's not permissible speech. I mean, the concern that districts have, that districts should have in terms of teachers just posting whatever they want in their classrooms is that in essence, a classroom is we typically, I don't know if you guys spoke about this, but we typically think about that as sort of a closed forum, right? People can't just walk in off the street and start, you know, announcing, talking and posting things and speaking. And so the concern with teachers doing this is that when they do, and a district allows it, they then open it up to all other teachers, then allowing them to similarly post. And so we get sort of the war of the signs, and we get a lot of distraction in the classroom. I think the only exception to this likely is if they're posting things as a part of a curriculum, right? So if they're teaching about a historical moment or about a particular category, a category of folks in America, I'm thinking of, you know, our new requirement to teach history, LGBTQ history, and if they're posting the flag as part of that, the historical aspect of that, I could see that being proper. But for the most part, the concern again about teachers posting their own individual signs is that opens up the forum to teachers posting whatever they want. So then we have a Black Lives Matter sign in one classroom and a Blue Lives Matter sign in another, both of which seem to be, you know, district speech, and then we get into really, really murky terrain.
All right, so Dana, what about a school, a student wearing a MAGA hat on a Zoom class?
Well, obviously that's going to depend on your school district's policy on two things. Number one, hats, and number one, speech. Or, you know, you can't limit the student's speech, but you can limit, like what Nicki said earlier, like anything with letters on it is not appropriate. So if you have a policy like that, you could certainly curtail it. But absolutely telling a student that they can't wear a hat with a political message on it is not going to be permissible. You're going to need to look at your policy, and if that's something that you think is going to cause a problem, if it's going to make other students feel threatened, then you should be right now working with your council to re-examine your policy and determine how you're going to have a content neutral policy that minimizes this type of you know, expression. But again, you can't completely bar it. You have to do it in a legal way, and that means a viewpoint neutral policy that addresses the problem that you see happening.
I think that's what a lot of questions we're getting. So Dana, if you'd like to know, just kind of distinguishing between people who feel like, well, we should be able to restrict them from wearing, whether it's a MAGA hat or some of the other sort of, you know, with other sort of lettering on it, or on the other side, kind of a Black Lives Matter t-shirt or hat, and the idea being kind of you can't restrict one without restricting both. And I think that there is some.
Right. I mean, I think this is a good time. I mean, I do think that kids are really confused about this. I think teachers are really confused. You need to start with teaching them everybody about Tinker. Everybody should read it. 8th graders should read it. 7th graders should read it. Because that really explains to kids how that they can lawfully express their opinions in school. And we were talking about what an important time this is to teach that, and how we really need to focus on teaching that. And you know, there could be I think it's arguable that you could write a policy to sort of limit MAGA hats and certain displays, but it has to be viewpoint neutral, and you have to work with all the stakeholders in your school to get there.
So, and then Nicki, related to that, what about a school custodian wearing the same hat while on duty? Is that permissible?
So I'm really trying to hang on here, guys. So again, I apologize if I'm choppy. This is not, I will blame my children who are remote learning right now for taking all of the bandwidth. So no, I think you can limit staff speech in a different way than you can with student speech. Again, I think you can restrict your staff in terms of what they're wearing, because anything that one of your staff members wears is going to look like it's an endorsement by the district. And we know this is going to cause disruption in the school building with students. And so I do think that your ability to restrict staff in terms of what they wear in the school building is greater than potentially your ability, as Dana has outlined, in terms of your students.
Right, or handle that by, Shelli knows how to handle this. You give the custodians outfits to wear in the collective bargaining agreement.
That's
all kinds of nice outfits and you won't have that problem. Practical solution.
all right, Nikki, the next question that came in was, if students and faculty start a Black student union group at the school and they advertise meetings and activities with the image of a raised fist, is this permissible?
Right. So certainly, they have a right to create these groups, obviously in keeping with the district's policy related to student groups. I don't know that an image of a raised fist would violate any First Amendment issues in schools. I know Dana, again, I'm getting frozen again. So Dana, I know you dealt with this issue, and I think you fell on the same lines.
Right. I mean, I think this is a symbol. I think symbols that are, again, it's not speech, it's a symbol. It is considered speech under the First Amendment, but this is a student group. This is not an outside political group. They're using an image to promote their group. So as long as, the high school has clubs, we didn't talk about the Equal Access Act, but if the Black student club can start just as any other club that is in existence in the high school. So this is definitely, it's a historical reference for those of you that don't know. It's from the Olympics in 1968, but it is legally permissible.
All right, next question. Student asks a teacher during a discussion of the upcoming election who the teacher is voting for. The teacher simply answers the student's question honestly and guides the student back to a neutral and civil dialogue with peers. Is the teacher potentially at fault for sharing his view? Dana.
So I think potentially, yes, the teacher did do the right thing in this example, is that they guided the student back to a neutral, respectful discussion. But I do think this is an area where teachers just need a little bit more training. As a teacher, you're neutral. You're Switzerland, as they used to say. You're just neutral. You are presenting both sides. There are policies on this in the instructional section of your policy book. IESB has policies on this about how teaching on controversial subjects, I think, is the header for it. So the teacher did answer the student's question honestly, but there could be parents that object to that, because teachers do have some are held in very high, and this is a good thing, they're held as in high regard by their students, and parents might feel that's, sharing a political view or who you're going to vote for would be an interference that a teacher shouldn't make. And so generally teachers should avoid taking sides. They can present dialogue. We want them to present dialogue, but saying who you're going to vote for is probably not a good idea.
Yeah, I would definitely encourage, I really believe that administrators need to be training teachers on this. I know I missed part of the discussion, but I know one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is the fact that this is a really, teaching students how to have civil discourse and how to navigate through these very controversial issues and keeping teachers neutral is something that is of huge value to students right now and to our communities. And I think administrators need to, we do trainings on this. They need to provide this kind of training to their teachers.
All right. Let's do this one. A health teacher decides to take a few minutes at the beginning of class to discuss students' views on the next election. One student takes out a MAGA bumper sticker and proclaims Trump 2020. The teacher sends the student to the office for taking out campaign materials and promoting politics in class. Nikki, can the student or teacher be disciplined in this instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really hard stretch that the teacher created this opportunity to talk about the election and then decides to discipline the student for taking the teacher up on the offer. So I definitely think that we'd be hard pressed to discipline a student for engaging in this conversation. Again, great if the teacher could steer the students to a productive conversation on this topic. I think the teacher really needs to be careful here. You know, again, I'm a really big fan of school districts deciding in advance. So teaching teams, your PLCs, your grade level teams, deciding in advance how these issues are going to be discussed. I'm not sure health class is the place to have a discussion about the election. Maybe social studies, maybe other courses. And I really think that they should be planned ahead of time, and they should be thoughtfully done so that students, you know, can think through the issues of the election, the important historical issues, as well as how to engage in civil discourse. I think sort of having a fly by the seat of your pants class and health class may not be the right approach. So again, really thoughtful work on the part of administrators to make sure that all teachers are on the same page and are thinking through how these lessons are going to be presented in class.
Right. I mean, and well, my question would be that doesn't the health teacher have enough to worry about with talking about sex? You know, that's sort of the other thing that goes back to Nicki's whole thing. You should decide in advance, like, who is going to be talking about this. It's not the most natural thing to talk about the presidential election, you know, maybe in certain classes versus others, you know, especially if you're in the middle of something. Like if you're in the middle of, you know, Einstein's theory of relativity, and all of a sudden you start talking about the presidential election, that's going to be, I think, unnatural and maybe cause more problems than you should have. And that's not saying that you shouldn't talk about it, but planning, just like you would plan any other curricular activity, is the key here. I think, and also the student, depending on, you know, it depends how the student proclaims Trump 2020. I mean, if he stood on his desk and yelled, I would definitely send him out, because we don't stand on our desks and we don't yell. And I think that's part of teaching the appropriate discourse on subjects that are controversial, that we treat people respectfully and we don't act obnoxiously, as they would say.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what Nicki was saying earlier about the importance of training. So making sure that your administrators are giving the message to all teachers, so there's an understanding as to why, if the social studies teacher brings this up, it might be appropriate, whereas if the PE teacher brings it up, perhaps it's not appropriate to do that. And so making sure your teachers understand that from the outset.
So we have so many questions in the chat. Can I just, normally we tell people to put questions in the Q&A, but I don't want to ignore them. So can I just go through them, and Nicki and Shelli, we can sort of, and then we'll go back, just sort of clear them out, because I think some of them are related to things we've already talked about. So one of them is, what about staff on their Facebook pages wearing MAGA hats or t-shirts? Is this the same as staff wearing Black Lives Matter clothing on Facebook or on their Twitter pages? And I think the answer there is yes. Would we all agree?
Yes.
That if their personal Facebook page, they can come on. So we've talked about that. Someone asked what Tinker is. Tinker versus Des Moines is just a very famous student speech student speech case from the 60s. The students wore the black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. So you can Google that and it should come right up. The Tinker children are still alive, and they come on Channel 11 or NPR every year on the anniversary. So that's fun. What about a Confederate flag in a predominantly African-American school? I know we have a question about this. So do we want to answer that?
Go for it, Dana. Go for it. Why don't we start that?
All right. So a Confederate flag, we actually talked about this prior to our webinar today, is obviously speech. And it's, again, goes back to what Nicki initially said about, is the speech likely to cause, or will it cause, a substantial disruption? And I think in this case, in our current climate, and this shows how fact sensitive this is, that yes, that would cause a disruption and you could remove that. But again, we need to know all about the context of it before we make the determination. If it was part of a class, if they were studying something, you might come up with a different answer.
So then here's another one, Dana. If we wanted to allow staff to wear certain shirts, Black Lives Matter, for example, can you restrict other attire, or do you have to allow it all? And I think that's one thing that we started to talk about. This idea that if you're going to be restricting speech, you have to make sure that you're really looking at how you're restricting it, if you're allowing one form of speech but not another. And so I can't say, you know, certainly yes or no definitively until you know kind of what context you are restricting the speech in and allowing it in others. You really have to look at that. But as a matter of principle, you can't say, you cannot monitor kind of the type of speech that's on there with respect to supporting one position or another. That would not be permissible.
Right. And I think it's all about, if you don't want to open the forum, everything has to be tied back to what you're teaching and what your mission is. Right. I think that's what Nicki has looked into this extensively. And I think it has to be tied back to something that you're teaching. So if you're having a district-wide initiative or a district-wide curricular initiative that's related to, and the Black Lives Matter t-shirts are part of that, you might just be able to allow that as part of that curricular initiative. But if you're just saying on any Wednesday, wear the t-shirts you like, then you definitely are, you're more likely opening the forum, and you're inviting people to wear all types of t-shirts for all different messages. And that, I think, there's a reason we want to not have that, is that we don't want our schools to be burdened with people being upset with each other constantly. We want to have a climate that's conducive to learning.
All right, here's another one. The superintendent was fired and a counselor sent out an email to district parents and students asking them to support the superintendent, protected or not protected. I'll tell you, when I originally read this, I don't read this as a First Amendment issue. I read it as an issue of the counselor engaging parents and students in an improper way with respect to the request to support the superintendent. I think that sending out an email, certainly in their capacity as a counselor, to parents and students when they've obtained those email addresses through their professional position at work, is more problematic than anything else. I think that if this counselor was doing this on their private social media page, just asking people to write in to support the superintendent or not support the superintendent one way or another, I think that would be different analysis as to whether or not that could be disciplined or not. And I would say likely not, unless it had that kind of substantial impact back on the ability of the school to move forward or that counselor to perform their job. So that would be my answer.
Back. Thank God.
I may be back. It may be temporary, guys. So
I'm calling Comcast right now.
Seriously. I feel like all my neighbors are just sucking all the bandwidth away and just thwarting me in my First Amendment discussions here. Okay, I am completely lost as to where we are, but someone asked a really good question in the actual Q&A function about differentiating between personal and public social media pages. There are some staff that post school-related items on their personal pages. I know you guys were just talking. Let's put aside administrators for right now, because that administrators I think are sort of always on. But I think teachers need to understand, and this is what I train and counsel when I talk to teachers about this, which is, you by all means have personal Facebook and social media pages. By all means implement whatever safety or privacy controls that you can. But you have to understand that if you put something out on social media and it gets picked up and teachers see it, other community members see it, students see it, even if it's quote unquote a private page, if it impacts your ability to carry out your job responsibilities, we're back to the same Pickering test that Shelli no doubt talked about eloquently, although I couldn't hear it at the beginning, which is that do the posts somehow impede their ability to carry out their job duties? Is it causing a disruption in the school, their relationships with students, their relationships with their fellow employees? The bottom line is that there's no such thing really as a private Facebook page when you are a teacher, insofar as if your posts get out there and they do have that impact, you could be disciplined for it. So teachers do need to be aware of that, and it sort of comes with the job, it comes with the gig.
Right. Or, I mean, I think people just need to be reminded, employees especially. I had a situation where a teacher actually posted, a teacher was very vocal in the union that the teacher should not come back to school because it wasn't safe, but then posted on her website that she thought everybody needed to be in school instantly. And, the school, when it was her own school, she totally posted something that was contrary to the position that she took at the bargaining table in school. And it's like people don't recognize what they're doing, and they're maybe liking something or going on someone else's page is like, yes, I support you, but they don't even know what they're supporting. So, you know, I do think that this is so worthwhile of a discussion. Again, I know we've been hammering that point because I'm not sure people are very mindful of what they're posting sometimes. And even on, you're right, you could get disciplined for something that's on your personal page if it crosses one of these lines, and people need to be aware of that.
Yeah, just a reminder to anybody listening, and those of you who know me know this is kind of what I do, but that's not just about First Amendment. I mean, teachers need to understand from the beginning that things that they put out there for the public to see that impedes their ability to be a role model or teach kids or keep things directed on the educational experience and not on their own personal life, they can be disciplined for that. And making sure you take care of that early on so it doesn't become the culture is really important.
I love this question in the chat. I don't know. I don't think we got to this, Dana, the one from the science teacher.
Oh no, get to that one. That's a good one.
Okay, it says, as a science teacher, teachers are supposed to be neutral, but what about topics like global warming? This is not a debate in terms of science. It's a social political debate. 99% of scientists are aboard. If I present this as debatable or controversial, I'm telling students that all science, laws, and theories are debatable. It undermines what a science is trying to teach about the nature of science and reasoning. So yeah, no, I mean, I don't, I'm assuming that part of your science curriculum is to teach about global warming because that is a scientific, an understood scientific phenomenon, I guess is the word. I'm not a scientist.
Right, you have facts to present there. Like, I don't think that's something that needs to be previewed with, we're going to discuss this as a controversial topic. I think controversial topics to me are not things like that. They're more like legalization of drugs. Right. We're going to discuss this. It's a controversial topic. People have, and I guess you're right, people have different opinions on global warming, but there is science behind that. And to teach that, you would stick with, you're teaching it from a factual perspective. So I also think it's important not to look for, you know, just because something has been made an issue in the media, it does not necessarily mean it is an issue from a pedagogical perspective.
Right, yeah, I mean, I'm fine with, we don't have to, you're not required to teach creationism versus evolution, right? Because evolution is scientifically supported and creationism is not. And so, you know, you should teach global warming, the facts behind global warming, because that is, you know, and you should teach the science behind it. I don't think that you necessarily need to present it as a debate if the scientific community believes that global warming exists, which it does. So I think Dana's exactly right. This is not really like you don't have to present two sides of a debate in a classroom if there aren't from the pedagogy from which you are teaching as a scientist and as a science teacher.
You know, Sonia, I'm going to shout her out. I shouldn't. Had a good question in actually the Q&A. Thank you, Sonia, because I think this is a great question. There was a thread on Twitter showing a kindergarten teacher classroom in which she had posted one of those signs that contains a series of statements, not obviously political, but known to be associated with liberal positions. Black Lives Matter, love is love, women's rights are human rights, science is real, political, private speech. So I think I think the first issue is her classroom. What do you guys think? Or maybe you can't dissect them that way. Maybe it's I mean, some love is love to me is just not going to be a problem. I think that can be up. I think it's related to what we talked about with global warming. Like, I don't see that as controversial or a political message. I mean, what do you think?
You're talking about it the way that it's all together, though. I mean, if you've seen that I believe the sign Sonia is referring to that we see lots of places. Mm-hmm. Is the one sign together. And it really is a question of whether or not that is intended to be inclusionary, to let the students know, is she doing it for that purpose, or is it her intention to let the students know that all are welcome, or is she making a political statement with respect to it? And I think that's where it gets tricky as to determining if you're going to allow that, if you have parents who are still seeing it as not the inclusionary message, but the political message, that's where there could be problems associated with it. So you might want to talk to the teacher about, is there another way that you can express that same position without doing something that's potentially seen as political by some of your parents who might be seeing that on the Zoom. Nicki, I don't know if you feel any differently about that.
Yeah, I mean, and Sonia asked another question about does the age of the students matter, and I wanted to bring that in because what's underlying all of this, just to bring us back to sort of the legal principles here, right, is that K-12 schooling is compulsory, right, and so what you have essentially is a captive audience, and what the courts have recognized is that particularly when you're talking about the young kiddos, right, who don't have a frame of reference, there's even more reason why a district needs to, control is a strong word, but really craft and advise teachers on what they need to present in a classroom, right? They really are there, teachers are there to provide the curriculum that the school board and the district have adopted. As kids get older, I think there is a little bit more flexibility on the part of teachers because the critical thinking skills of students obviously develop, and so their ability to understand a more nuanced argument or to engage in a conversation about these issues, I think, is more enhanced, and there's less of the teacher says, the second grade teacher says it, so it must be so. I think the problem that we get into with signs is that we then, and I know one of our districts out there right now is dealing with this, we get into this war of signs, right? And as much as teachers may feel like, this is a really welcoming sign for a particular group of students, we're going to get another teacher who believes that there's a different sign that may offend other sensibilities in terms of welcoming students. And we get into this really gray and murky area where we, again, get a war of signs. And that is literally what is happening at one of our school districts out there right now. And we're very sorry that they're going through that. So I think to the extent that school districts can think about, like, one of the things that we talked about with Sonia's question is, this is about welcoming students, making them feel comfortable and safe. So as a district and as district administrators, you should be thinking, and grade level groups, what can we do? What can we present? What can we put in classrooms that is universal, that we can universally, post that makes students feel welcome? And so that it's consistent and it's part of the district's overall curriculum and equity. We talked at the beginning, districts have a little bit more leeway here, right? This is part of our curriculum. We're doing an equity piece. Every teacher or every school building is going to have this sign about equity, about inclusion, about welcoming. That, I think, is a better route than having individual teachers making those decisions.
And I honestly think that's why I think that Sonia's question was so important, because there's signs, like, it is a marketing thing. You know what I mean? We have, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but they're so easily accessible. And I think teachers, and I was a teacher, you love posters, you love art for the classroom, and I think, yes, most of what you saw on that sign, the love is love, those are positive messages that really don't have a political intonation. So I think what Nicki said is, you can't really rely on something that you go buy in the store. It's got to be personalized to what you're trying to do in your district. And that might be even a great way to sort of bring people together on this issue. I just thought of this, is to have some sort of committee in the school. Like, what's going to be our sign that's like that, but that really does include everyone and relates to our school community and what we're trying to do with our kids in our school community? What's our sign going to be? You have your own sign and your own message that's very mindful of all of these constraints, but can still be powerful and can still convey some of the things that you want to convey: inclusivity, respect for others, those types of things.
We're getting a lot of questions in, and I know we sort of, again, I apologize if we answered some of these. We're getting a lot of questions in about how, whether BLM or MAGA, like whether, or Confederate flags, whether the sort of the makeup of the student body is going to be, whether that is going to be a factor in analyzing whether student speech is substantially disruptive. And I know I just sort of summarized a whole bunch of different questions on this point. I think that the answer is yes. Certainly the courts have in the past. I mean, I will say that the case law on this is a little bit all over the place. So I can't give you sort of the black and white, no pun intended, law here. But I do think that there is, there definitely, if a student body, for example, has a sizable African-American community, there's been racial issues in the past, throwing a Confederate flag in the mix is certainly likely to cause a substantial disruption, and those are factors that a court would look at if you curtail that speech. And so those factors are going to weigh in on this matter. I will say that it is likely that given the heightened tension right now, particularly in the wake of all of the protests over the summer, that any sort of very divisive racial symbolism like a Confederate flag, I would guess, or I would argue that a court might find that just I'm not going to guess, well, introducing that would be in and of itself disruptive because of the moment that we are in. So even if the student body isn't predominantly Black, or you haven't had specific racial tension, that may be a factor, just the time that we're living in.
And I also think it's a factor. I think this goes back to one of the themes that we're trying to convey, is it's not just the makeup of the student body generally, like this is a predominantly white school or this is a predominantly Black school. I think it's actually your school. I can think of schools right now where the student body is predominantly white, but this would cause a huge disruption in because of where the community is on these issues and how students feel about them. And I think you could cause just as much of a disruption. So just saying all white or all Black, divorced from the actual situation. So I think a lot of times people want us to give us an answer, like if X happens, you do Y. This just is not going to happen here, because it's going to be not just on the makeup of the student body, but what's going on in that community, what parents are feeling, what comments you're getting from the public, what groups are active in your school community and who come to your board and talk to you. All of those things are going to play a factor.
Yeah, and I think, I think the answers to all these questions lead to a bigger point, which, is a tough thing. And I love Tom Hernandez's comment in the chat, what a crazy world we live in. We do live in a crazy world. This is a very heightened time. And in some ways, my feeling is that school districts, both fortunately and unfortunately, are in the position that folks are, you are going to be educating your students by how you respond to these issues. And so making sure you're responding thoughtfully and that you're bringing in community and you're talking through, Dana's great idea about, creating a sign or looking at these issues. I think you're going to be teaching your students about how to deal with these issues by how you deal with them. And so that, being thoughtful about these issues, I think is critical. And it is an unfortunately gray area of law, but I think, making sure again, for your classroom speech that you are thinking about this across the board, and that you're teaching your students, like if someone shows up, with a MAGA hat on, and you have a parent call and complain, we had that question, one parent complaining is probably not a substantial disruption, but maybe there's an opportunity to have a conversation that's constructive with a teacher that is equipped, or you have a racial justice coordinator, or you have a director of diversity. So to have some of those community conversations about what these symbols mean and how other students may view them, this may be an opportunity.
We want to get back to some of the questions that were asked and see if we can't kind of put a little bit of meat around those. So we have one on our Read Aloud video page. A teacher submits the book, A Day in the Life of Marlon Bundo, which is an LGBT children's book. The book highlights a same-sex relationship by a bunny owned by Mike Pence. Can this speech be limited? Which one of you take this?
This is a parody book, I thought. Where is this from, Nikki? Is it like Stephen Colbert?
I don't know, but I just have to get this book, I think.
It's Stephen Colbert, or it's somebody. I don't know that it's even really a real children's book. I thought it was like a parody of something, but regardless, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that go into that discussion. First of all, you have to read the book. It's not that you can just limit by viewpoint. The fact that it's about a same-sex couple, that is not permissible grounds to just say we're not going to read it. It's got to be appropriate for the age, obviously. So you could look at that. You could look at the way it's presented. But you can't just say, oh, it's about, a same-sex couple, so therefore kindergartners don't read it, because that's not, it's not legally correct under the First Amendment, first and foremost, but that's not true to the experience of many first graders who probably have parents that are of the same sex. So, that's why the law is the way the law is, for some extent, to allow us to continue to evolve.
One of our helpful colleagues has indicated that it's John Oliver, or
hey, thank you.
So
somebody of that nature.
I guess my feeling is if there are there are quite a few really wonderful books out there that are age appropriate for children on LGBTQ issues, that present same-sex couples as a typical family, just as all of our other families. And so I'm not sure the purpose of sort of throwing this sort of politically charged book that may or may not be a children's book, sounds more like a parody, into the mix. So there may be grounds. We would have to take a look at the book. I think certainly, as Dana says, teaching about the diversity of our families is certainly something that is permissible.
I think here obviously the point of it being that this bunny is owned by Mike Pence, and whether or not this was the appropriate book to be selected, regardless of the age of the children, for an educational purpose. So I would think this reading of this book likely could be limited, but I'd obviously need to know more on that as well. So you want me to get back to some of our other questions?
Let's get back at it. Yeah.
So here's another one that came in. We have a student who creates a social media account with the school name and then rapists, and encourages others to name the names of people they know that have sexually assaulted someone. Either one of you want to take this? I guess there's two components to it. There's one of the student creating the page using the school district's name, and on the other side of it being that they're requesting that people write in as to whether or not they know someone who's engaged in sexual assaults.
Yeah, there was a clarifying, it says to clarify, the name of the page is OPRF Rapists, and encourages others to name the names of people they know that have sexually assaulted someone. No, in quotes. Sorry, go ahead, Dana.
So, I mean, I think if it's clearly not I think this is less of a First Amendment issue. Like, are they using this? It's more of a, can you name the school, and what authority do you have to name the school? And I think you have to, I haven't seen the web page, but you need to understand how it's being used. I mean, is it being used is it being portrayed as something, this is official? Is it speaking out against the school? Is it speaking out against the individuals who are maybe not punished? I mean, I think all of those play a factor in how you address this. And that goes beyond the First Amendment, I think, a lot of that.
I think some of this question also is kind of the students engaging in off-campus conduct in a social media, on a virtual platform, and the impact it then has back to the school. Because if you remember, there's a line of cases that talk about those kids who were making face, and at that point it was, I think, MySpace was still kind of the way, and they were making those fake profiles on their principals and assistant principals, and then putting horrendous things on there as if they were posting them. And there the courts found that was not enough. I mean, that they just didn't, obviously it was very upsetting to the administrators, but they were actually posing as those people. And ultimately they found that in those cases, there was not the substantial disruption that they could discipline those kids. So I think here we would have to really look at what the impact of the page is, in addition to what you're talking about, Dana, as to whether or not they are presenting it as if it is an actual school-sponsored social media page.
Yeah, I think there's also issues here. I mean, this is really one of the toughest scenarios, and I don't know that there's a clear-cut answer. If they're putting up their other student names as alleged rapists, I mean, that is just so, I can't imagine that that's not having a disruptive quality in the school building. It's also just a terrible thing. I mean, I think at minimum, you'd want to bring the students in to have a conversation about this. And I understand this sort of call out culture, and then, folks think that a district isn't handling something appropriately. And so then they take to Twitter, and there's all sorts of names that are being thrown out there. I mean, the damage that does across the board, and in many cases to victims as well, I think can be incredibly damaging. I don't know that there's a silver bullet for that kind of situation. But I do think that at minimum, if student is calling out other students, they need to be brought in, maybe remotely to the school, and this needs to be a conversation. And there may be discipline that's available should it be disruptive to the school environment, but I do think that there needs to be the district does need to address this.
I know we're kind of getting close to the end here. I did want to ask another question that we had received. It relates to kind of the difference between why you can potentially not discipline a teacher for what they post negatively about the district or about an administrator, let's say, on their social media page. But then could you discipline, or is the standard rule different for an administrator? And I know, Nicki, before you had said, like, we're going to not talk about the administrator at that point, But in terms of, is the standard different when it's actually an administrator we're talking about who's putting something out there? I don't know if either one of you want to speak to that.
Well, I mean, I think that's definitely a different standard, because the administrator is really the head of the school, the leader of the school, the face of the school, right? So if a superintendent has a web page, and especially in many of our communities, are suburban communities, they're close-knit communities, the superintendent is a person of note and a person of interest in the community. Whether they want that to be the role or not, that's the role. And so I think it's very hard to divorce what they put on their pages from their role. And I think if it can be perceived as part of their role, then it is going to be encompassed by all of this analysis and First Amendment analysis, and we're going to have to follow it.
Yeah, because I would think that in many of those instances, the person is actually not speaking as a private citizen, right? So in terms of if the page is out there and it is publicly available, and they're speaking about matters about the school district, because they're also supposed to speak on matters of the school district,
Right.
They're the private citizen, even if that's their intent. I think that's where some confusion lies. All right, so let me see if we can get another question in here that we've not already touched on. Let's see. Move back here. Okay. I think we've already touched on this a little bit, but we'll go over it again. A very opinionated, well-known English teacher has a personal Facebook page in her name. She does not have students as friends, but has a long history of making racist, anti-Semitic, vulgar, and insensitive posts. Is this behavior protected by the First Amendment, or is the teacher vulnerable to potential consequences?
No, I think it depends on the impact of the Facebook post. She doesn't have students as friends, but we need to know how much it's out there in the community and how much it's impacted her ability to do her job. If she, like me, has like 4 Facebook friends, because I only talk to my cousins, it may be First Amendment protected speech, no matter how odious it is. But if it has a bigger impact on the community and it is interfering with her ability to do her job in the classroom, then it could be something that is addressed by the school.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, first of all, we would have to unpack some of the language to make sure that it is even First Amendment protected. I mean, depending on how vulgar and how lewd it was, I suppose we could be down that road. But assuming, as I think Dana is correct too, that it is protected by the First Amendment, you know, again, we talked about this before, the fact that it's a private page may not shield her. I mean, we've seen this school year or recently teachers being fired because of racist speech on social media. So I'm love to see that we have some teachers on the call. I know you guys are navigating through these issues. It's really complicated, but we have seen that already, and I think those terminations will be upheld because teachers are role models, right? And their ability to serve that role and to reach all of their students is going to be greatly impeded if they start undermining that by posting prejudiced speech.
I know we talked a little bit about before, but because we are all living in the world of Zoom so much, and I think everyone's come to know my very messy bookshelf behind me, is there anything that the districts can do to limit what kids can either put up kind of behind them in their Zoom room? Or I think there was another question that came on, like when my screen closes, you often see the picture of 2 of my dogs, but when people's screen closes, they have something else up there. I think someone mentioned MAGA or Black Lives Matter. What can schools do to restrict kind of either of those things on the student side, not on the teacher side?
So again, and I'll let Dana weigh in too. Again, if you have a content neutral policy, then you are in safe legal ground. And so if you basically say the only thing, like on your Zoom, when you close off your Zoom, the only thing that you can post is your name, then that is a content neutral. That is a rule that applies across the board. Likewise, if you say that the only, the backgrounds are a little bit more complicated, I think, because someone could literally have a big flag in their background, right? But I think we could think through some content neutral rules about folks' background. But again, that's really, there's a lot of nuance there that's important, but again, trying to make sure that you're just restricting all speech across the board rather than specific speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those things that for students, you can certainly restrict a lot. And I think, as they get older, you just have to start about thinking how to restrict it in a productive way. So these content neutral things, if you think someone's going to, post something inappropriate, you come up with a system that's not inappropriate. You can have your favorite sports team. You can have your favorite band as long as no one's naked in the picture. You can have, think of a category that's going to engage students. And because I think this could, it's a negative thing, but you can turn it into a positive. So think of ways to restrict that's viewpoint neutral, but still allows them to express some things. Because I think that's what you're seeing. The reason people do that, right? The reason everybody's doing that is because they want you to know something. And if you find a more positive way for them to tell you that, more appropriate way, you're doing your job to the best way you can do it. So look for those opportunities. We have to get to our private school question, even though it's 101, because we did get a question in, and it's so easy, the answer. Person from a private school said they're in a very controversial state right now because of all that's going on in the world, and they have students wearing all kinds of things and parents complaining with all kinds of political message. So everybody, what's the answer? Can you limit it?
Yes. Yes. The great thing about private schools, no First Amendment issues.
So on that note, we'll all be jealous for our private school counterparts for a minute. I think we're about wrapped up.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you next week when Nick and Mike are joining us here. Thank you again for sending in all of your questions. We're sorry we didn't get to all of them, but hope you have a great week.
One thing I did want to mention is that we are going to be doing more on First Amendment stuff coming up, so keep a lookout for that. We know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to, so we will take all of them because we'll be doing another presentation on this in the next couple months.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.